The cold came before the snow that year. It arrived in November like a quiet creditor, settling into the bones of the land, drawing the color out of the grass, stiffening the mud into iron. By the 1st of December, the thermometer outside Harlan's Mercantile in Millhaven read things that made men go pale and say nothing. By the 5th, it had stopped being a number and become a condition, a permanent, indifferent state of the world. Winifred Calloway had lived in Montana long enough to know the difference between a hard winter and a killing one. This was a killing one. She knew it the way she knew most things, not from books or weather almanacs, but from the way the animals behaved, from the way the horses pressed against the south wall of the barn without being told, arranging themselves by instinct against the wall that absorbed the most of the thin winter sun, from the way the birds had disappeared entirely by mid-November, as if the sky itself had decided to stop hosting them and sent notices, from the way old Clover, their milk cow, had taken to standing in the corner of her stall with her eyes half closed and her breath coming out in slow, reluctant clouds, as though she was rationing it against some anticipated shortage. Winifred had stood in that barn on the morning of December 5th and pressed her forehead against Clover's warm flank and listened to the steady, patient drumming of the animal's heart. She had stayed there longer than she needed to. She was not a woman given to delay or to sentiment that interfered with the next necessary thing. But that morning she allowed herself those few minutes of warmth and of the particular comfort that large animals offer, the comfort of a creature entirely present in its body, entirely unconcerned with anything beyond the immediate, because she understood, in the way the body sometimes understands things before the mind is willing to confirm them, that warmth was about to become the most precious and most uncertain thing in her life. She had been a widow for 53 days. Garrett Calloway had died on the 13th of October, taken by a fever that moved with a speed and purpose that made prayer feel inadequate and medicine feel like suggestion. He was 34 years old. He had been, in every practical sense, the legal anchor of their life in Millhaven. His name on the property charter, his signature on the claim, his standing in the community that gave their small cabin on the eastern slope its right to exist within the township's understanding of itself. He had been more than that, of course. He had been her compass, her laughter in the evenings, the man who spoke to the horses by their given names and who could remember the birthday of every person in town and never forgot to mention it. But the law did not care about any of that. The law cared about names on paper, and Garrett's name was gone. The meeting was called for 10 o'clock in the morning, in the back room of Harlan's Mercantile, which served simultaneously as the town hall, the post office, and the de facto courthouse of Millhaven, Montana, a consolidation of civic functions that spoke to the town's size and to the practical character of the people who had built it. Winifred had dressed carefully that morning, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she understood that appearance was the only armor available to her and she intended to arrive armed. She wore her good wool coat, the dark gray one with the brass buttons, the one she had worn to Garrett's funeral 7 weeks before. She pinned her hair back with the 2 bone pins her mother had given her on her wedding day. She wore her boots, the sturdy brown ones with the double-stitched soles that Garrett had ordered from a cobbler in Helena 3 years ago. She had resoled them herself last spring, sitting on the porch in the April sun with an awl and a length of waxed thread, because they were good boots and good boots were worth the labor of maintaining. She helped her mother dress first. Dorothea Vane was 70 years old, and her body had begun the slow, incremental process of negotiation with age that the years eventually demand of everyone. Her hands trembled when she poured her morning coffee. Her knees required a full minute of careful conversation before they would agree to carry her down a flight of stairs. Her back had curved in the last 2 years, bending her slightly forward as though she were permanently inclining towards something she could not quite reach. But her eyes had not surrendered a single thing to the years. They were the gray blue of a sky in the hour before a storm, clear and watchful and filled with an intelligence that age had not diminished but only refined, the way cold refines metal, stripping away everything that is not essential and leaving only what will hold. Dorothea sat on the edge of the bed while Winifred buttoned the back of her dress, and she said nothing. She did not ask what the meeting would decide. She did not offer reassurance or the gentle, useless comfort that people sometimes offer when they cannot change what is coming but feel obligated to acknowledge its approach. She simply sat with the straight-back composure of a woman who has survived enough of the world's cruelties to understand that most of them arrive wearing the costume of procedure, of necessity, of regrettable but unavoidable circumstance. They walked to the mercantile together, Winifred's arm linked through her mother's, moving slowly over the iron-hard ground, their breath rising in white plumes that the wind took and scattered immediately, as if even that small evidence of their warmth was too much to be permitted to linger. The room held 14 men. Winifred knew all of them. She had cooked for most of them at one time or another, for church socials, for harvest gatherings, for the informal celebrations that small towns generate to mark the passage of seasons and the survival of winters. She had sat across tables from their wives and helped stitch quilts and put up preserves and talked through the quiet difficulties of life in a place that tested people constantly and rewarded endurance more reliably than it rewarded cleverness. She had shaken hands with these men at Christmas dances and nodded to them at the feed store, and once, 2 winters back, had sat with 3 of them through an entire night while their friend Lon Pierce lay dying of a broken leg gone gangrenous, keeping the lamp filled and the coffee hot because there was nothing else to be done, and she could not leave a man to die in the dark without someone awake to witness it. None of them looked at her now. They looked at the table, at the floor, at the wall. One of them, old Bert Hadley, who had once told Garrett at a church supper that Winifred was the finest cook in 3 counties, was studying the grain of the wooden tabletop with the focused, reverent attention of a man reading important scripture. Another had found something requiring close examination on the underside of his hat brim. The room had the particular atmosphere of a group of people who have agreed, without speaking the agreement aloud, to look everywhere except at the person whose presence is the reason they are assembled. Aldous Greer stood at the head of the table. He was 55 years old, lean as a fence post, with a face that Montana winters had weathered into something closer to granite than skin, not hardened by cruelty exactly, but by the long practice of making decisions that affected other people and learning to separate the necessity of the decision from any feeling about its consequences. He had run Harlan's Mercantile for 30 years, had sat on the town council for 20, and possessed the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who have learned, over many years of small authority, to mistake the rules they administer for the wisdom that produced those rules. He held a single sheet of paper in both hands, and he looked at it rather than at Winifred when he began to speak. His voice was the voice of a man performing a duty he found mildly unpleasant but entirely necessary. The voice of an accountant presenting an unfavorable balance. The voice of whether the property charter, he said, was specific in its provisions. The claim reverted to the township upon the death of the signatory unless there was a male heir of working age or a co-signatory of legal standing. There were provisions, he continued, for widows in certain circumstances. But those provisions required the widow to be self-sufficient, unencumbered by dependents requiring substantial care, and able to demonstrate reasonable and independent capacity for maintaining the claim through the duration of the claim period. Given the circumstances, and here he allowed a brief, weighted pause, the pause of a man who has rehearsed this moment and has decided that the pause serves the dignity of the proceeding, given the circumstances of Mrs. Calloway's situation, the council had determined unanimously that the provisions did not apply. He set the paper down. He said, "You have until sundown to vacate the property. The township will provide a day's rations and safe passage to the county road." He said it the way a man says it is raining, as simple as weather, as impersonal as the temperature on the thermometer outside, as final as a door closing. Winifred did not speak. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened to the silence that followed. His words settled into the room like snow settling onto a frozen field, evenly, without preference, covering everything it touches with the same impartial weight. She felt the eyes of 14 men not looking at her. She felt the weight of the room's discomfort, which was not the same thing as the room's regret. These men were not sorry for what was happening to her. They were sorry to be present in the room while it happened, sorry for the awkwardness of it, sorry that the procedure required a witness, and that the witness was themselves. They wanted to be elsewhere. They wanted this concluded. There is a specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with temperature. Winifred Calloway felt it then, sitting in that back room of Harlan's Mercantile, surrounded by men she had known for years, men who had eaten her cooking and borrowed her husband's tools and trusted her to keep their confidences the way women who live in small communities always end up keeping everyone's confidences, whether they asked for that responsibility or not. The cold of being looked through. The cold of being reduced in the space of a single procedural morning from a person with a history and a name and 14 years of presence in this community to a problem requiring resolution before the next item on the agenda. She stood up. She looked at Aldous Greer. Not with anger, not with the pleading he might have been bracing for, not with any of the emotional registers he had perhaps prepared himself to receive and deflect. She looked at him the way she had looked at the thermometer that morning in the barn, steadily, as one looks at a measurement one intends to act on, taking in an accurate reading, storing it away. She nodded once, a single sharp movement of her head. Then she walked out. The cold outside was a relief after the cold inside. She stood on the frozen dirt street of Millhaven for a long moment and let the wind find her face, and she looked north, toward Ridgeback Mountain, which rose above the town like a dark declaration, its upper ridges lost in the gray wall of cloud that had been building since before dawn. She looked at it for a long time. Garrett had looked at that mountain the same way she remembered, with a respect that bordered on conversation, as if the mountain were something you could negotiate with if you approached it with sufficient honesty about your intentions. She turned and walked back to the cabin. Dorothea was sitting by the cold hearth when she entered, wrapped in every blanket they owned, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the door from the moment it opened. She had not lit a fire. She had been waiting. The two women looked at each other across the cold room. So, Dorothea said, just the one word. It carried everything necessary and nothing extra. Winifred said, "We have until sundown." Dorothea nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had already concluded on her own. She unfolded her hands and placed them deliberately on her knees. "Well," she said, "then we had better begin." What followed was 2 hours of the most deliberate work Winifred had ever done in her life. She did not allow herself to grieve the cabin, though grief was present. It moved through her in waves she acknowledged and then set aside, the way you set aside a tool that is not right for the current job. This was not the time for grief. Grief was a luxury she would permit herself later, in some other place, when the question of survival had been answered one way or another. For now, there was only the ruthless calculus of what to take and what to leave. She took the axe, Garrett's good one, with the hickory handle he had shaped himself over 3 winter evenings, talking while he worked about the spring planting and the fence line that needed mending on the north pasture. She took the small folding saw with the birchwood grips. She took the cast iron pot and the single iron skillet and the fitted lids for both. She took 2 sacks of flour, the bag of salt, the tin of coffee grounds she had been rationing since October, and the last of the dried beans from the root cellar. She took every blanket and every piece of wool clothing they owned, folded and strapped to the small wooden sled Garrett had built for hauling firewood from the tree line when the snow was too deep for the mule. She took the tinderbox and the spare flints and the full bottle of lamp oil and both lanterns. She left the furniture, because furniture cannot be carried and survival cannot wait. She left the curtains Dorothea had sewn from flour sacks the first winter, when they had nothing better and made them beautiful with embroidery anyway. She left Garrett's books, 3 of them, their spines cracked from use, books he had carried from Illinois and that she had always meant to read and now understood she never would. And she left his winter coat hanging on the nail by the door. She could not bring herself to take it down. Some part of her needed it to remain where he had left it, on the nail where his hand had placed it for the last time without knowing it was the last time. She left it there as a kind of message, to him or to herself, something that said, "I was here and then I was not, and it was not by my choosing." She put on everything she could wear at once, 2 wool dresses layered over her heaviest undergarments, Garrett's large canvas work coat belted over the top with a length of rope, his scarf wound twice around her neck and jaw, her own mittens pulled on over his heavier work gloves. She looked, she thought, like something assembled from several different people, which was in a sense exactly what she was, assembled from her own necessity and from the remnants of a life she was leaving behind and from whatever she had not yet discovered about herself. Lifting Dorothea onto the sled required care more than strength. Her mother had grown light in the way that the elderly sometimes do, as if the years were slowly returning the body towards its essential components, removing everything non-essential. She was sharp angles and surprising weightlessness, and lifting her required attention to fragility rather than effort against mass. But what made it hard was not the physical difficulty. What made it hard was the look on Dorothea's face as Winifred wrapped the blankets around her and tucked them in at the sides and checked the rope knots that would keep her secured to the sled. It was not fear on her face, not embarrassment at needing to be carried, not the helplessness that sometimes comes over the elderly when they must be tended like children. What was on Dorothea Vane's face as her daughter prepared to pull her into the unknown on a wooden sled in minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit was trust. Total and unqualified trust. The kind that contains no reservation, no contingency clause, no terms. The kind that says, wherever you are taking me, I know you can get us there. The kind of trust that is itself a form of love, perhaps the deepest form. The trust that asks nothing and doubts nothing and simply leans into the person being trusted with the full weight of itself. Winifred had to look away for a moment before she could finish the knots. She hitched the sled to her shoulders using canvas straps she fashioned from the mule's old harness leather, the same straps Garrett had used when the snow was deep. Clover stood at the cabin door as Winifred maneuvered everything out, watching the preparations with her large, patient brown eyes. When Winifred began to move north, the cow simply fell in behind without being asked or directed, as if she had been waiting for precisely this moment and had simply needed to see which direction they were going before committing herself. The town watched them leave. Winifred did not look back, but she felt it. The eyes behind the windows, the shapes at the curtain edges, the weight of a community choosing, collectively and individually, not to see what it had done. She put her shoulder into the sled harness, and she walked north toward the mountain, toward the dark wall of cloud that had now descended to swallow the upper third of Ridgeback entirely, toward whatever waited on the other side of this particular decision. The ascent began in the early afternoon. There is no adequate accounting, in ordinary language, for what cold of that magnitude does to the body and to the will. It is not merely a matter of temperature, of degrees on a scale that can be read and recorded and compared against previous readings. It is something more fundamental and more personal than that. Cold of that severity becomes a presence in itself. It acquires intention. It seeks out the places where the body is least offended. The wrists, the ankles, the narrow gap of skin between the collar and the jaw. And it works on those places with the patient, focused craft of something that understands exactly what it is doing and has unlimited time in which to do it. It turns breathing into labor. It makes every step a negotiation with a surface that offers no purchase and no accommodation. The snow on the lower slope was the fine, dry kind that compacts underfoot into something almost frictionless, and pulling the loaded sled through it required a constant forward lean that transferred itself into a burning line across both shoulders and down the center of Winifred's back. She counted steps. She had learned this discipline years ago during a difficult crossing of the Yellowstone in flood, that when the fear is too large to confront as a whole, you reduce your world to the dimensions of the next step. Just this step, then the next. The one after that can wait. Dorothea had not spoken for more than an hour. Winifred stopped and turned back, and what she saw stopped her heart briefly and then restarted it with a different rhythm. Harder, more urgent, the rhythm of a body mobilizing its deepest reserves. Her mother's lips had gone the color of a winter sky just before full dark, that particular bluish gray that the body produces when it is being honest about its situation in ways that words cannot be. Her skin had acquired the waxy translucence that Winifred associated with deep cold and deep danger. Her breath was visible, but barely, a faint whisper of vapor above the blanket edge rather than the steady, visible clouds that warmth produces. Clover stood with her head lowered, trembling in long, full-body shudders that moved through her hide like waves. The light was going. The sun had been useless all day, a pale disk behind the cloud cover that provided illumination without any warmth, like a lantern behind thick glass. Now even that was failing, sliding toward the western ridge with a speed that felt contemptuous, as if it could not be troubled to linger. The temperature, which had been savage throughout the afternoon, dropped further with the light in a way that felt almost personal, as if the cold had decided that this particular stretch of slope and these particular living things deserved its concentrated attention. Winifred's own sweat had frozen on her brow. She could no longer feel her smallest toes on either foot. She stood on the slope and looked at her mother and looked at the mountain above her and looked back at the distant lights of Millhaven, barely visible through the thickening dark. And she felt something arrive that she had been holding at bay since 10 o'clock that morning. Despair. Not the theatrical kind that weeps and seeks an audience for its performance. The quiet kind, the arithmetic kind. The kind that presents itself as simply a clear-eyed accounting of the available facts. No shelter, one incapacitated woman on a sled, one old cow, supplies for 2 weeks at careful rationing, temperature below what any thermometer she owned could reliably measure. A mountain that the whole of Millhaven avoided for reasons that seemed, up here in the failing dark, entirely sensible. The thought arrived with a terrible gentleness, like a hand placed softly on the shoulder. It would be easy to stop, simply to stop, to unbuckle the harness and sit down in the snow and let the cold complete what it had already begun. It would not be violent, she had heard. Men who had nearly frozen and survived described the deep cold as eventually becoming something like warmth, a false warmth, a lying warmth, but warmth nonetheless. A feeling of settling, of being carried somewhere easier than here. She looked at her mother's face, at the faint, stubborn flicker of life still present there, at the trust, still visible, even in unconsciousness, in the particular angle of Dorothea's head, the tilt of a woman who has leaned on someone reliable for so long that the leaning has become structural, has become part of how she is built. Something broke open in Winifred's chest. Not her resolve. Her resolve did not break. What broke was the despair itself. It cracked under the pressure of something that rose up from beneath it, something older and hotter and considerably less willing to be reasonable. It was not courage in any formal sense. It was not the heroic emotion of stories. It was simpler than that and more animal. A flat, physical, non-negotiable refusal. A refusal to accept the verdict that the cold and the mountain and the 14 men in the back room of Harlan's Mercantile had together written for her. She opened her mouth and she screamed into the wind. Not words. There were no words equal to what she was feeling. Just sound. Raw. Ragged. The sound of something alive, insisting on its aliveness and against everything that was working to end it. The wind took the sound and shredded it and scattered it across the slope, and it meant nothing to the mountain and less than nothing to the cold, but it meant something to Winifred. It meant that she was still there, still making noise, still refusing. She bent back into the harness. She moved. And perhaps 15 minutes later, time having lost its ordinary shape in the cold and the dark, she saw it. A shadow different from the other shadows. Against the gray-black face of the rock cliff above her, there was a darkness that was deeper than the surrounding darkness, a negative space in the stone with a different quality to it. Not the flat darkness of solid rock, but the living darkness of depth, of space beyond. And from that space, barely perceptible, visible only because the wind had momentarily paused in one of those random cessations it sometimes grants without explanation, from that space came a faint breath of mist that was warmer than the air around it. Not warm, warmer, but warmer was everything. Winifred aimed for it the way a sailor aims for a light, whose source is not yet known, because it is the only point of distinction in the undifferentiated dark, and therefore the only direction worth moving. She dragged the sled the final distance up the slope with strength she did not know she still had, drawing on something below muscle, the reserve that lives beneath the body's ordinary resources and becomes available only when the ordinary resources have been entirely spent. The entrance to the cave was not grand. It was a jagged wound in the rock face, roughly the height of a standing man and somewhat wider, shaped by water and geological time rather than by any consideration for human convenience. The floor inside the entrance was broken, uneven stone. The walls were slick with moisture, frozen into a faint glitter where the last of the light caught it, but the wind stopped. The moment they crossed the threshold, the wind simply stopped. The howling that had been constant for 3 hours, that had become so much a part of the afternoon that Winifred had stopped hearing it as sound and started experiencing it as condition. It ceased. The silence it left behind was so sudden and so complete that she stood motionless for a full moment, her body still braced for an assault that was no longer coming. She brought the sled inside. She helped Clover through the entrance, the old cow stepping over the threshold with the careful deliberation of a large animal navigating an unfamiliar surface. She checked her mother's pulse, finding it at the wrist after several terrible seconds. Thin, fast, but present, and she allowed herself one full breath of relief before moving to the next thing. The next thing was light. She fumbled with the lantern and the tinderbox, her fingers so numb they operated more by memory than sensation. The first match snapped without catching. The second lit and was extinguished by her own unsteady exhalation. She cupped her hands around the third with a concentration that reduced the entire world to a 3-inch space between her palms, and the flame caught and held, and she transferred it to the lantern wick. And the lantern bloomed into yellow light that pushed the darkness back far enough to show her what the mountain had been keeping. She raised the lantern. She saw the firewood first. A stack of it, split and seasoned, piled nearly to her shoulder against the far wall of a chamber, perhaps 30 feet across, with a ceiling high enough that the lantern light did not reach it. The wood was old, gray with years, but dry in the particular way that wood only becomes in enclosed, protected spaces over long periods of time, dry all the way through, light when she lifted a piece, with the faint, sweet smell of old pine. Next to it, a collapsed ring of stones that had once been a hearth, its mortar crumbled with age. Above the collapsed hearth, a dark fissure in the rock face that angled upward and disappeared into the ceiling. Tools, a rusted axe head without a handle, a saw with what appeared to be a repaired, hand-carved grip, a small wooden crate bound at the corners with iron straps, sitting against the wall. Winifred stood very still and looked at all of it. Someone had been here before her. Not recently. The dust and the age of everything made that clear. But deliberately, thoughtfully, with the patient intention of a person building something meant to outlast their own presence. She was not the first person this mountain had chosen to shelter. She was not the first person desperate enough to find this place and grateful enough to receive what it offered. She crossed to the wooden crate and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oil-treated canvas that had preserved it against the cave's damp, was a journal. The cover was dark brown leather, cracked at the corners, stained in the particular way of something handled often and carefully over many years. She opened it with the care due something understood to be important. The handwriting was dense and deliberate, the hand of a man who had taught himself to write with the understanding that clarity was not a courtesy, but a necessity, that words set down in a place like this might need to be read by someone in circumstances too serious for any ambiguity. On the first page, in letters slightly larger than the rest, as if the writer had understood that this line was the one that mattered most. If you found this place, the mountain did not turn you away. Neither will I. Below it, a name, Prentice Holt, and a date, October 1861. Winifred Calloway stood in the cold heart of Ridgeback Mountain and held that journal in her numb hands and read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then she looked at her mother, who was beginning to stir on the sled, whose eyes were opening slowly to the lantern light, with the careful, wondering expression of a person waking somewhere unexpected, not yet certain whether the unexpected place is good or bad. She looked at Clover, who had found a corner of the chamber and settled herself against the wall with the decisive heaviness of an animal that has made up its mind about where it is spending the night and will not be persuaded otherwise. She looked at the stack of dry firewood. She looked at the collapsed hearth and the fissure above it. She looked back at the journal. Aldous Greer had told her she had until sundown. Sundown had passed. The world outside was killing dark and killing cold, and everything she had known and built and loved in Millhaven was behind her, closed off, finished. She had been delivered to the edge of nothing and told to vanish from the accounting. But she was not at the edge of nothing. She was at the beginning of something. She did not yet know what that something was, did not know the man whose name was on the first page of this journal, did not know what he had built here or what it had cost him, or whether any of it would be sufficient to what the next weeks would demand. She did not know what she would learn or fail to learn, what she would lose that she had not already lost. But the mountain had not turned her away, and there was dry wood stacked to her shoulder, and a fissure in the rock above a collapsed hearth that might draw smoke if rebuilt correctly, and a journal written by a man who had been here before her and had survived, and her mother was alive and opening her eyes with those clear, gray-blue irises that had not surrendered a single thing to 70 years. Winifred set the lantern down on the stone floor. She took off her mittens. She picked up the first piece of firewood from the stack. She began. The first thing Prentice Holt ever taught Winifred Calloway was this: a cave is not a shelter, it is only the possibility of one. She understood this on the second night, after the first night had been survived on stubbornness and body heat and the considerable warmth that Clover generated simply by existing in the same enclosed space. They had slept in their clothes, all three of them pressed together near the collapsed hearth, woman, woman, cow, in an arrangement that would have appeared absurd in any other context, and in this one was simply the arithmetic of staying alive. Clover's broad, warm flank against Dorothea's back. Dorothea's thin body curved against Winifred's. Winifred facing outward, watching the dark with the lamp turned low. She had not slept. She had kept the lantern burning, and she had read. Prentice Holt had come to Ridgeback Mountain in the autumn of 1861, which placed his arrival in the kind of year when men either moved toward war or away from the consequences of deciding not to, and either choice required explanation in some quarters. He did not say in the journal what had brought him here, and Winifred did not require the explanation. A man writes what he needs to write and omits what he needs to omit, and the important thing was not his reason for arriving, but what he had done after he arrived. What he had done was learn. The journal was not a diary in any conventional sense. It was not a record of feelings or of days passing or of the emotional texture of solitude. It was a manual, the document of a man systematically acquiring knowledge about a specific problem, how to live in this particular mountain, in this particular cave, through winters that would have destroyed anyone who approached them with ordinary assumptions, and recording that knowledge with the plain-spoken precision of someone who understood that the knowledge itself was more valuable than any account of the man who had gathered it. Winifred read by lantern light while her mother and her cow slept, and she felt, with a certainty that required no rational basis, that Prentice Holt had written every word of this journal directly to her. On the second morning, she began work on the hearth. The instructions were specific. Holt had made his own mistakes before arriving at the design that worked, and he had documented those mistakes with the same precision he applied to the successes, because he understood that failure correctly observed is simply knowledge presenting itself in more demanding clothes. The base needed to be wide, 3 feet minimum, using the flat granite slabs from the western wall of the chamber, which held heat longer than the other stone. The firebox needed a particular geometry, wider at the base and narrowing toward the throat, to create draft conditions that would pull smoke upward through the fissure rather than allowing it to billow outward into the cave. The throat, he had written, must be taller than it is wide. This is the single thing that matters above all other things. Everything else can be adjusted. The throat cannot be wrong. Winifred spent the first hours of the second day moving stone. The flat granite slabs were in the western wall, exactly as Holt had described. They were also each the approximate weight of a promise made by someone considerably larger and stronger than herself. Moving them required a methodology she invented as she went, working the saw blade into cracks to use as a lever, rolling the slabs rather than attempting to lift them, using the broken axe handle as a fulcrum, in the way that Garrett, who had been an engineer of the practical kind, would have recognized and approved. Her hands, which knew the grammar of needle and dough and laundry, but not the grammar of stone and iron, began to bleed at the knuckles from the third slab onward. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her second wool dress and kept moving. Dorothea directed from her seat against the wall. This was the arrangement they arrived at without any discussion, the way capable people in urgent circumstances often arrange themselves, by honest assessment of what each person can and cannot do, and by the absence of any pride that would interfere with that assessment. Dorothea could not haul granite, but Dorothea's mind was as precise and functional as it had ever been, and she had in her 70 years accumulated a body of practical knowledge that had never required credentials because it had always been the invisible kind, the knowledge that women carry without being asked to and apply without expecting to be thanked. She watched Winifred work and said things like, "That stone is not flat on the bottom. It will rock under load. Find another. And you are pulling through your back. Use your legs, or you will not be standing tomorrow." And once, quietly, when Winifred had been staring at the partially assembled base for several minutes without moving, "The problem is not the stone. The problem is you are trying to make it perfect. Make it solid. Perfect is a luxury we cannot currently afford. Winifred made it solid. She found the clay Holt had described, a seam of it near a slow seep of water in the cave's back passage, gray and slightly gritty and cold as everything else, exactly where he had said it would be. She mixed it with sand from the cave floor and a small amount of additional material that Holt had specified with the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who had long since prioritized function over squeamishness. The mixture worked. It was not beautiful mortar, but it filled the gaps between the stones and hardened in the cold air, and it held. She built the firebox according to Holt's geometry. She built the throat taller than it was wide. She sealed every crack she could identify with the clay mixture, working it into the joints with her fingers until her hands were caked gray to the wrists, and she could no longer distinguish the cold of the stone from the cold of her own skin. Then she knelt before the new hearth and laid the kindling. She used the smallest, driest pieces from Holt's woodpile, thin pine splinters, split fine enough to catch from a single spark. She arranged them in the pyramid form her father had shown her when she was 7 years old, the shape that allows air to move through the fuel rather than being smothered by it, and placed 3 larger pieces on top at angles that would allow them to fall inward as the kindling consumed itself. She struck a match. The kindling caught with a small, tentative eagerness. For perhaps 5 seconds, everything proceeded as it should. The small flames climbed the kindling with a confidence that lifted Winifred's heart. And then the smoke came. It did not rise. It rolled forward from the firebox in a low, spreading wave, dark, thick, immediate, and within seconds it had filled the lower third of the chamber with a choking gray cloud that sent Clover lurching to her feet with a panicked cry, sent Dorothea into a coughing fit that bent her double, and sent Winifred scrambling to stamp out the fire she had spent most of a day building toward. She got them out. She half-carried Dorothea to the cave entrance and settled her on a stone just inside the threshold, where the worst of the wind could not reach, but the air was moving and breathable. She led Clover out by the halter and stood with the animal in the bitter dark, one hand on the cow's warm neck, and she did not move or speak for a long time. The cold outside was the honest kind. It stated its intentions plainly and did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. Winifred stood in it and let it find her face, and she thought about Aldous Greer's voice reading the terms of her eviction with the flat certainty of a man accustomed to being the final word on any subject. She thought about 14 men not looking at her. She thought about Bert Hadley and the grain of the wood. She thought about the coat on the nail. The thought of lying down in the snow was still available to her. It had not withdrawn simply because she had refused it the evening before. It was patient, the way cold is patient, the way certain categories of defeat are patient. It did not demand anything. It simply remained. A door left slightly open against the possibility that she might reconsider. She looked at it directly this time, the way she had looked at Aldous Greer. She acknowledged that it was there. She acknowledged that she was cold, and her hands were bleeding, and her first attempt had failed completely, and the mountain was enormous, and the night was enormous, and neither of them had any investment in whether she lived or died. Then she went back inside and picked up the journal. She found what she needed in the middle of Holt's second notebook. He had filled 3 during his years on the mountain, and all 3 had been in the crate. He had written about his own first fire with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. But beneath the precision, in the spaces between the practical observations, she could feel the texture of a man who had been in exactly the position she was in now and had made a specific choice. My first fire failed, he had written. The smoke would not draw. I had built the throat wrong, square instead of tall, which is an error any mason could have corrected in a minute if I had thought to ask a mason before climbing a mountain. I had no mason. I had only myself and the wrong information I had brought with me. I sat outside in the cold for 1 hour. Then I came back in and tore it down and started over. The mountain teaches slowly. This is not a defect in the mountain. It is simply the terms of the arrangement. Winifred read that passage twice. Then she set the journal down, picked up the broken axe handle she had been using as a lever, and began dismantling the hearth she had spent the day building. She worked through the night. Dorothea slept against Clover's flank, wrapped in blankets, her breathing steady and shallow. The lantern burned. Winifred tore down the firebox to its foundation and rebuilt it according to a precise rereading of Holt's diagram. A small sketch in the margin, drawn with the care of a man who understood that someone else might one day need to replicate what he was recording. The throat she rebuilt as a tall, narrow rectangle. She resealed every joint with fresh clay, working by feel as much as by sight in the dim lantern light. Her hands learning the language of stone, the way hands learn any language. Through repetition in the dark, through mistakes corrected and approaches abandoned, and solutions found by the process of eliminating what does not work. She finished before the gray light that served as dawn in that December arrived. She laid fresh kindling. She knelt on the cold stone floor. She struck the match. The kindling caught. She watched the smoke with the absolute attention of someone for whom this single column of gas is the most consequential thing in the world, because it was. The smoke rose from the burning kindling and drifted toward the throat and paused there. One suspended, terrible moment in which the entire enterprise hung in complete uncertainty. And then it straightened. It went up, not dramatically, not with any fanfare. It straightened with the gradual decisiveness of something making up its mind, and then it rose in a clean column through the throat and into the fissure and above and disappeared into the mountain. And from somewhere above came a low, resonant sound, the sound of air moving through stone in the direction it wanted to go, the sound of a system working as designed. The heat came next, not the aggressive, immediate heat of an open fire that fades when you step back from it. This was different, radiant, patient, spreading outward from the heated stone, the way understanding spreads from a truth that has been fully received, slowly, evenly, reaching further than it appeared to from any given distance. It found Winifred's face first, then her hands, then worked through the layers of her clothing toward the cold that had settled deep in her joints over the previous 2 days, and it began to displace it, methodically, without hurry. Dorothy awoke. She looked at the fire. She looked at the clean column of smoke rising through the throat and vanishing. She looked at Winifred kneeling on the stone floor in her ruined clothes with her clay-caked, bleeding hands, and her face that had, in the space of 48 hours, acquired something it had not possessed in Millhaven, a quality stripped of all its social register, essential and entirely awake. A tear traced its path through the grime on Dorothea's cheek. She held out her hand. Winifred took it, and they remained like that for a long time. The two of them and the cow and the fire that had cost 2 days and 1 night, and all of whatever a person keeps in reserve against the worst things, burning now clean and steady and true in the heart of a mountain that had, against any reasonable expectation, decided to let them stay. That was the turning. Everything that followed grew from that morning the way a tree grows from the soil that receives its root, shaped by the specific conditions of the ground, impossible to understand apart from where it began. The days acquired structure. Winifred spent the early hours each morning on exploration, moving through the cave system with a candle and a piece of chalk, marking her path on the walls as Holt's journal instructed, mapping the passages and chambers and cataloging what each contained. She found his food cache on the 4th day, a side chamber 20 feet into the back passages, cold as a root cellar, holding a canvas bag of dried beans, a twist of smoked fish in oilcloth, and 3 ceramic crocks of rendered lard sealed with wax. She sat down on the cold stone floor of that chamber and pressed her forehead to her knees and allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was not quite weeping and not quite prayer, but contained genuine elements of both. On the 7th day, she found the coal seam. Holt had mentioned it obliquely in his second journal, a vein of soft, dark material in the eastern passage that burns hotter and longer than wood. She had not known precisely what she was looking for until she found it, recognizing it by the smell and the black stain it left on her hands, and the way a small fragment of it, held near a candle flame, began to catch and hold. Coal changed the mathematics of their survival in ways she could feel before she could calculate. The relief of it, the way the arithmetic shifted from desperate to merely difficult. She built the stone partition wall Holt had described, a low barrier around their living area that trapped the fire's heat and made the 30-foot chamber into something of human scale, a room within the cave that a fire could actually warm. She used the same flat granite slabs, the same clay mortar, and by the end of the 2nd week she had enclosed perhaps 12 feet square that held warmth the way cupped hands hold water. imperfectly but sufficiently, which was all that was required. Inside that enclosure, with the fire burning and a tallow candle lit, and Clover settled into her corner with the philosophical patience of a cow that has accepted its circumstances, it was warm enough to remove the outer layer of clothing. The first evening this became possible, Winifred sat in her single wool dress and looked at her hands in the candlelight and barely recognized them. The knuckles were scabbed over in new places. The palms carried calluses that had not existed before this mountain. The nails were broken uniformly to the quick, the cracks packed with clay and coal dust that no amount of the cave's cold water could entirely remove. They were the hands of a person who had been doing something she had never done before, and her body had responded by becoming what the work required. She was a different person than the woman who had sat in Aldous Greer's back room with her fingers folded neatly in her lap. The transformation did not announce itself. It accumulated, the way the heat accumulated in the stone, gradually from the inside, reaching further than it appeared to from any given moment. Each morning's work added to it. Each problem solved deposited something into a reserve she had not known was available to be filled. The fear did not leave her. She did not become fearless on the mountain. Fearlessness was not what the mountain required and not what it produced. What changed was the relationship between herself and the fear. It became a tool rather than a condition. It provided information about risk and urgency and where to apply the next hour of work, and she learned to use that information without being governed by its volume. It was on a careful reading of the second of Holt's 3 journals that she found the passage that stopped her entirely. He had written about leaving the mountain in 1868. He had been on Ridgeback for 7 years, and he was 50 years old, and his knees had reached a point of negotiation that the mountain's terrain was no longer willing to accommodate. He had decided to come down. He had spent the last summer before descending building a cabin at the foot of the mountain, small, sturdy, built with the same practical intelligence that had built the cave shelter, expressed at a different scale and for longer-term occupancy. "I sold the cabin in the spring of 1872, he wrote, to a young man from Illinois named Calloway, who had a wife and plans and the particular brightness of expression that belongs to people who have not yet been fully introduced to what Montana winters intend for those who come here underprepared. I hope the cabin serves him as well as this mountain served me. I told him nothing about the cave. A man should find his own way to the things that save him. And a woman too, for that matter, though I confess I did not think to write it that way at the time." Winifred read the passage 3 times. She read it a 4th time to be certain she had understood it correctly. Garrett had bought his cabin from Prentice Holt, the man who had built her shelter in this cave, whose journal had guided her hands through the cold and the failure and back to fire, had built the home she had just been evicted from. Prentice Holt was the invisible architecture of her entire life in Montana. The cabin she had lost, the cave that had received her, the journal that was at this moment keeping her alive. She had never met him, she would never meet him. He had in all probability been dead for years. But she was alive because of the specific quality of his mind, and because of the generosity of a man who had written down everything he knew and left it in a wooden crate for whoever was desperate enough to find it and honest enough to use it. She took the pen she had found in the crate's bottom, a stub of graphite pencil, worn nearly to nothing, and she wrote in the margin beside that passage, in her own smaller hand, "I am the wife he mentioned. I found my way here. Thank you, Mr. Holt." February arrived with a brutality that made December feel like a preliminary argument, a clearing of the throat before the actual statement. The blizzards came in sequence, 3-day storms that buried the cave entrance under drifts that Winifred had to excavate each morning to maintain the airflow the fire required, working with a flat stone she had shaped into a crude shovel, pushing through the packed snow while the wind drove ice crystals horizontally and the temperature dropped to figures she had stopped attempting to measure. They were managing. Not comfortably, not without ease, but managing, which in February on Ridgeback Mountain was the equivalent of thriving. And then came the night of the worst storm. It arrived on the afternoon of the 14th of February with a character different from the previous storms, not merely more intense, but more serious, a quality to the air that Winifred had learned to read as the mountain's particular warning. She brought in double the fuel she thought they would need. She checked every seal in the stone wall. She blocked the entrance with flat stones, leaving only the gap necessary for air circulation. By nightfall, the wind had descended below a howl into something more fundamental. A frequency felt in the sternum rather than heard by the ears, the sound of something very large and very indifferent asserting itself. The entrance was sealed behind several feet of drifted snow. They were, in practical terms, inside the mountain now. Winifred was adding coal to the fire when she heard it. Not the storm. The storm was constant, a condition rather than an event. This was different. A sound with intention in it, intermittent, uneven, directed at something. She stopped moving and listened. It came again. Someone was at the cave entrance. She looked at Dorothea. Dorothea's eyes were already open and watchful, having registered the sound at the same moment. A complete conversation passed between them in the firelight without a word. The particular efficiency of two people who have been living under pressure in close quarters and have developed, without intending to, a shared shorthand. Winifred took the lantern and moved the stones from the entrance gap one by one until the opening was large enough to see through. The wind hit her face immediately. She raised the lantern and looked out. A figure. A young man by the build and the height, though it was difficult to determine much beyond that. He was on his hands and one knee in the snow just outside the entrance. His other leg extended at an angle that told her immediately it could not bear weight. His clothing was town clothing, a wool coat suitable for a cold walk between buildings, not for a mountain in February. Smooth-soled boots, no hat. His face, when he raised it toward the lantern light, was the blue-white of a body at the outer edge of its ability to sustain itself. He was perhaps 22 years old. He looked at the light the way drowning people look at an extended hand, with everything that remained to him. Winifred held the lantern and she looked at him carefully, the way she looked at everything on this mountain now, thoroughly without rushing to a conclusion. She looked at the face, at the line of the jaw, and the shape of the brow and the particular set of the features that families transmit from one generation to the next as reliably as eye color in the tendency towards stubbornness. She recognized him. Fletcher Greer, Aldous Greer's son. She had watched him grow up in Millhaven, had seen him at Christmas socials and behind the mercantile counter, learning the family trade with the ease of a young man who expects to inherit a going concern. He was not a bad young man. She had no grievance with Fletcher personally. He was simply the son of his father, which in Millhaven meant a certain presumption of standing that had never needed to be tested by anything more demanding than a cold walk across the main street. He had not yet recognized her, she was certain of that. In the dark, in the storm, wrapped in canvas and Garrett's old coat, her face weathered beyond its December version by weeks of smoke and cold and outdoor work. She was not the person he would have connected to this mountain if he thought of her at all. She stood in the opening and she held the lantern and she considered what she was looking at with the full, unhurried attention the moment required. The son of the man who had read the property charter in a flat, impersonal voice and told her she had until sundown. The son of the man who had not looked at her. He was going to die in the snow outside her cave if she did nothing. This was not a moral position or a sentiment. This was simply a clear-eyed assessment of the available meteorology. She moved the last stone. "Get inside," she said. Her voice had developed, over the past 7 weeks, a quality it had not possessed in Millhaven. Lower, more deliberate, the voice of the mountain itself, which does not waste words on ceremony or softening. But you work for your warmth. That is the rule of this place. He could not stand without help. She put her shoulder under his arm and brought him in, the way she had brought in her mother 2 months ago. The way Prentice Holt had in his journal said any person who found this place deserved to be received. Not because they had earned it through some prior virtue, but because the alternative was a specific and entirely unnecessary death, and she was not willing to be the kind of person who stood in a warm cave and allowed that. She settled him by the fire and examined his leg, a significant ankle sprain, possibly a fracture, sustained on the slope. She had no medical training, but she had 7 weeks of improvised treatment and Holt's notes on wrapping and splinting, and she applied what she knew. He lay by the fire and looked at the stone walls, the organized stores, the low partition, the cow in her corner, and his face moved through confusion, disbelief, and then a slow, widening recognition that she watched without comment from across the hearth. He looked at her, really looked for the first time since she had opened the entrance. She saw the moment he understood where he was and who had brought him in. He opened his mouth. She shook her head once and turned back to the fire. There was nothing useful to say about it yet, and possibly nothing useful to say about it ever. And the storm outside was 3 days of reckoning that did not care whose father had signed what document and had no patience for human grievances. They were two people who had both needed the mountain and both been received by it. And for the duration of this storm, that was the only category that applied. Dorothea, from her place against the wall, watched all of it. She said nothing. But when Winifred caught her mother's eye across the cave in the firelight, there was something in Dorothea's expression. Not approval exactly, not validation, but something older and more serious than either. The look of a woman who has seen her daughter make the right choice under the hardest possible conditions and has the wisdom to let the choice speak for itself. The storm ran for 3 more days. Fletcher Greer worked for his warmth, as Winifred had said he would. He could not stand, but he could sit and tend the fire, adding coal when the level dropped, keeping the flame steady through the night hours when Winifred allowed herself a few hours of sleep. He did it without being asked twice. He was, she concluded, not a bad young man. He was simply a young man who had not yet been required to discover what he was made of, and the mountain had taken care of that particular gap in his education. On the third morning after the storm broke, she helped him to the cave entrance and watched him make his careful, one-footed way down the slope. He had fashioned a crutch from one of Holt's spare tool handles and a piece of cloth. He moved slowly. At the point where the slope flattened and the tree line began, he stopped and turned back and looked up at the cave entrance where she was standing. He did not call out. She did not call out. The distance between them and the quality of the mountain air made speech impossible anyway. He removed his hat. He had found a spare one somewhere in the cave stores, an old wool cap that had been Holt's, and he held it against his chest for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward Millhaven. Winifred watched him go until the tree line absorbed him. Then she went back inside to the fire, and then came Rufus Dade. He arrived on the first clear morning after the blizzard, tracking a deer whose prints had led him farther up the slope than he usually ventured. He followed the thin wisp of smoke from the cave's chimney fissure, the final quarter-mile, because a hunter's instinct for anomaly does not limit itself to animal sign. He stood at the cave entrance with his rifle at his side and his hat in his hand and his mouth open, taking in the fire and the stone wall, and the organized stores, and the two women and the cow. And he said, "By God, Winifred, we all reckoned you were dead." She gave him coffee, genuine coffee, brewed in the cast-iron pot from the tin she had been rationing since December. A deliberate extravagance chosen deliberately. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at her over the rim with an expression she had not seen on any face from Millhaven in a long time. He had ridden up with his younger brother Cooper, who had waited at the tree line with their horses and had not come in. Winifred filed that information away without comment. Rufus went back to town. She had known he would, and she did not try to prevent it. But she also knew, with the same accumulated certainty that the mountain had been teaching her since December, that the story Rufus Dade carried back to Millhaven would not be the story she would have told. Stories transform in the telling. They change according to the teller's understanding of what the audience is prepared to receive and what Millhaven needed to hear in a February of killing cold with flour running low and 3 families consolidated into 2 houses for warmth. What Millhaven needed was a story about something found, not about something built. 3 days later they came. Not all of them, but enough. 8 men, some with shovels, some with that particular hunger in the eyes that belongs to people who believe someone nearby has access to something they do not. They climbed the slope in a group and arrived at the cave entrance and looked past her into the warmth and the light with eyes that were searching for something she had not found and did not have. "Heard you struck gold up here," the first man through the entrance said. His name was Clem Whitfield, and he had been at the council meeting in December, third chair from the left, studying his hands. She looked at them, all of them. She looked at their faces, men she had fed, men whose sick children she had sat with, men who had watched her leave in December without stepping off their porches, men who had come here not to help her, but to take from her whatever they believed she had taken from the mountain. The anger was real and present and entirely justified, and she felt it precisely. A hard knot in the center of her chest, specific and earned. And then her mother's voice from inside the stone enclosure, quiet and entirely certain. Winifred, just her name. But the way Dorothea said it was a complete instruction. Winifred stepped back from the entrance. She said, "Two at a time, 1 hour each pair. There is no gold here. There is a fire I built and stores I found and earned. If you want to be warm for an hour, you may come in. If you came for something else, go back down the mountain." She looked at each face as she said it, not challenging, not inviting challenge, simply making the terms clear, which was the only thing she had ever been able to control in any room. 4 of them left without speaking. 4 remained. She let them in 2 at a time, as she had said she would. She gave each pair a cup of hot broth, thin, mostly water, but warm, and she let them sit by the fire for their hour, and she watched the cold leave their faces 1 degree at a time, and she did not say, "Where were you in December?" She did not say, "Which way did your hands go when the vote was called?" She did not say any of the things that were entirely true and entirely beside the point of the specific hour they were all inhabiting together. She said nothing. She let the fire speak for her. Because the fire was hers. She had built it with stone, she had moved by hand, and clay she had mixed by hand, and wood she had split by hand, and coal she had found by following the directions of a dead man's careful handwriting. It was more completely hers than anything she had ever owned with a signature on paper. It was hers in the way that things are owned when you have made them from nothing at a cost that nothing else in your life has quite matched. No one could take that. Not Aldous Greer, not the 14 men, not the February of it, which had tried its best and failed. She stood at the entrance to the cave she had made into a home and watched the men from the town warm themselves at the fire she had built, and she was not generous out of weakness. She was not kind out of naivety or forgetting. She was generous because Dorothea Vane's daughter did not allow other people's smallness to determine the size of her own heart. And because Prentice Holt had left his knowledge in a wooden crate for a stranger he would never meet, and she understood now in the way you can only understand things that have cost you something real, exactly what that choice had meant. She was extending the same chain. She was learning what the mountain had been trying to teach her since December. March arrived in Montana the way it always arrives, not as relief, but as the beginning of a negotiation. The killing cold of February did not surrender. It retreated, incrementally and with obvious reluctance, the way a powerful man concedes a point he cannot avoid conceding, without acknowledgement, maintaining until the last possible moment the pretense that nothing has changed. The temperature rose in increments so small they registered not on any instrument Winifred owned, but in the behavior of things. The snow at the cave entrance no longer required excavation every morning. The light extended by minutes at both ends of the day. Clover's milk, which had dwindled through the worst of winter to almost nothing, began to return in thin but genuine quantities, as if the cow's body understood a shift in conditions that the thermometer had not yet confirmed. These were not comforts. They were signals. The mountain communicating in its own language that the terms of the arrangement between them were shifting again. Winifred had learned to read the mountain's language. She had learned it the way she had learned everything else in this cave, by paying close attention when she was too exhausted for anything else, by treating every failure as information rather than verdict, by applying the specific intelligence of someone who has been stripped of the option of pretending and must therefore work only with what is actually present. She knew which draft from the eastern passage meant snow accumulating on the upper ridge. She knew the particular quality of silence in the deep cave that meant the outside temperature had dropped below the threshold that made venturing out inadvisable. She knew the sound the fissure above the hearth made when the fire was drawing perfectly, a low, resonant contentment, almost vocal, and she knew the slightly different sound it made when the throat needed to be cleared. She knew this mountain now the way she had once known her kitchen in the Millhaven cabin. The knowing that comes from daily practice rather than instruction, embedded in the body rather than stored in the mind, available without having to be recalled. But March brought something the mountain's language had not prepared her for. Dorothea was fading. It was not a sudden thing and not a dramatic thing, and it was in its way the most natural thing in the world. The body of a 70-year-old woman, subjected to the hardship of December's journey and 3 months of cave living, settling toward its conclusion with the same deliberate patience Dorothea had brought to everything else in her life. There was no specific illness to name and no specific treatment to apply. She was simply wearing down to the essential. The reserves that had kept her mind sharp and her counsel steady through the worst of the winter, reserves built over 70 years of a life lived with intelligence and attention, were drawing toward their final accounting. She slept more. The intervals between sleeping and waking lengthened on the sleeping side and contracted on the waking side until some days the waking was measured in a few clear hours and the sleeping in the rest. She ate less, not from loss of appetite, she explained patiently when Winifred pressed her, but because her body had simplified its requirements. It knows what it needs now, she said. It has become very specific about it. But in her waking hours, she was entirely herself. This was the mercy in it, that Dorothea Vane's mind did not go ahead of her body into the dark. She remained in those waking intervals exactly the woman she had always been. Clear-eyed, precise, possessed of the particular authority that belongs to people who have spent 70 years paying close attention to the world and drawing accurate conclusions from what they observed. It was in those waking hours, in the firelit evenings of early March, that she and Winifred talked. Not the practical talk of survival that had characterized most of their winter, not clay ratios and coal measurements, and the proper technique for preserving dried beans against moisture. This was different talk, the kind that happens between two people who understand, without stating it aloud, that the time available for it is finite and should not be spent on anything that is not essential. Dorothea talked about Winifred's grandmother, a woman named Bess, for whom the cow had been unknowingly named, who had crossed the Missouri River in 1836 in a wagon with 4 children under the age of 7, and a husband who was better at envisioning things than at building them, who had arrived at their destination and constructed the first shelter with her own hands while her husband drew plans for a better one that was never built. A woman who had never in her life described any of this as remarkable, because she lived in the era before women were invited to consider their own endurance noteworthy and had simply regarded it as the baseline expectation of being alive. She talked about her own mother, who had survived a prairie fire in 1851 by lying face down in a creek bed for 4 hours with her 2 youngest children sheltered beneath her body, breathing through a wet cloth while the fire passed over them, and who had stood up afterward, verified that her children were alive, and walked 2 miles to the nearest neighbor's farm to report the loss of their own with the same tone she would have used to report a broken fence rail. Not because she was without feeling, because she understood that feeling had its place and the current place was not it. These were not entirely new stories. Winifred had heard fragments of them over the years, the way family history is usually transmitted, in pieces incidentally, as illustrations of other points. What was different now was the completeness with which Dorothea told them. The deliberate thoroughness of a person transmitting something important before the window for doing so is closed. She was building something for Winifred, a lineage, a chain of precedent and context. Women who had endured unsurvivable things and walked away from them without requiring the world to adjust its assessment of what they were capable of, without waiting for acknowledgement that was not going to come. She was handing it over piece by piece, in the way that Prentice Holt had handed over his journal, for someone else to use in circumstances he could not predict but could trust would eventually arrive. Winifred sat by the fire and held her mother's hand and listened, and stored every word with the same care she had given to Holt's practical instructions. These were instructions too, a different order of instruction for a different order of difficulty. One evening in the 3rd week of March, Dorothea was quiet for a long time after Winifred had added coal to the fire. The cave was warm in the settled, stone-held way it had become. Warmth that lived in the walls and the floor as much as it radiated from the hearth. Warmth that had accumulated in the rock the way time accumulates in a patient person. Clover breathed softly in her corner. The fissure above the hearth made its satisfied, resonant sound. Then Dorothea said, "I have to tell you something." Her voice had the quality it sometimes took in those weeks, stripped of all social register, down to the essential tone beneath all the others, the voice that does not perform and does not soften and does not take the long way around. Winifred said, "Tell me, I knew this cave." The words arrived without preamble and sat in the warm air for a moment before Winifred fully received their meaning. She turned to look at her mother. Dorothea's eyes were open and steady, looking not at Winifred but at the fire, watching the flames with the expression of a person who has decided to say the true thing and is prepared to sit with whatever the true thing costs once it is out in the world. "Your father and I," she said, the winter of 1848. We had been married 2 years. We were traveling north. He had heard there was work near the Canadian border, which was the kind of thing your father was always hearing about somewhere better than where we were. We got caught in an early snowstorm on the eastern slope of this mountain. We were lost. The horse had gone lame 3 miles back. Your father was... She paused, choosing her words with the precision of a woman who respects language and the specific things it can and cannot do. Your father was frightened, though he would not have called it that. I was frightened too. We walked for what felt like most of a night, pulling the horse behind us, and then I saw the entrance to this cave. She stopped. The fire spoke in her silence. We spent one night here, she continued. There was no wood then, or none that we found in the dark. We huddled together in the entrance chamber and held the horse and each other and waited for the storm to pass. In the morning, we walked down the mountain and found the road. I had not thought about this place in 30 years, not since your father died. And then you raised the lantern that first night, and I saw the shape of the ceiling, and I knew where I was. Winifred said very carefully, "You recognized it." "The first night," Dorothea said, "immediately. The shape of the ceiling is particular. The way sound sits in here. You do not forget a place that kept you alive when other places would have killed you." The fire crackled. From somewhere in the deep passages, a slow drip of water counted the seconds with perfect consistency. Winifred said, "You didn't tell me." "No," Dorothea said. Her voice was even and unashamed. "I did not." Winifred sat with this. She sat with the full complexity of what it meant. That her mother had known, had recognized, had kept her recognition silent through all of it. Through the terror of the first night, through the failure of the first fire, through the long, punishing work of moving stone and mixing clay and rebuilding in the dark. Through every moment when knowing that someone else had been here and survived would have changed the character of the fear. She could have told me, Winifred thought. She could have said, "I know this place. I have been here before. We are not entirely without a map." That single sentence would have changed the quality of those first terrible hours. She said, "Why didn't you?" Dorothea turned from the fire and looked at her daughter directly, not with the softness of apology, with the directness of someone who believes in what she did. "Because you needed to find it yourself," she said, "not to be shown to it, not to be told it was a place someone else had already survived. If I had told you, you would have known you were sheltering in a place your mother had sheltered before, a borrowed cave, a hand-me-down salvation. And what you needed..." She stopped, and something moved across her face, something that was not sentiment and not pride, but a third thing that incorporated both and exceeded them. What you needed was to know that the mountain had chosen you, that you had come here on your own and found it on your own and built it on your own. That was the thing I could not give you by telling you I had been here first. That had to belong to you alone. She paused. "And I knew you would find the journal," she said more quietly. "I knew it because you have always been the kind of person who opens every crate in a dark room, Winifred. Even when you are exhausted and frightened and have every reason not to. You were that way at 7 years old. I knew the journal would guide your hands. You did not need my knowledge on top of his. You needed to discover that you were capable of using his knowledge and building on it and making it yours. And you could only discover that in the dark." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a thing being fully understood. Winifred looked at her mother, at the 70-year-old face, diminished in some ways and in others more completely itself than it had ever been. The gray-blue eyes that had watched her across this cave for 3 months, with that expression she had sometimes tried to name and now understood. Not approval, not the maternal satisfaction of watching a child succeed. Something more serious and more rare than either. The look of a woman who has spent 3 months watching her daughter become exactly who she was always capable of being and has kept silent about it because naming it would have been a form of interference. They did not speak further about it that night, but Winifred held her mother's hand until the fire burned low, and when she finally rose to add more coal, she bent and pressed her lips to Dorothea's forehead. Her mother's hand came up briefly and rested against her daughter's cheek, dry and light as paper and warm from the fire. That was sufficient. Some things are too complete to fit inside language without being diminished by it. Dorothea died on the morning of the 28th of March. It was a Thursday. The light at the cave mouth was different than it had been, still thin, still provisional, but carrying within it a quality that had not been present before, a faint warmth beginning to accumulate the way warmth accumulates in stone, from within, invisibly, until the stone itself becomes a source. Outside, somewhere on the slope below the cave, Winifred had heard the previous afternoon the first sound of moving water, a tentative trickle under the snowpack, the mountain's first quiet announcement that the longer negotiation was resolving in spring's favor. Dorothea had fallen asleep early the previous evening and had not woken. There was no struggle in it, no moment of fear or resistance, simply a gradual lessening, the intervals between breaths extending through the dark, small hours with a patience that was neither peaceful nor its opposite, but was simply the body arriving at the conclusion it had been moving toward since December, arriving there in warmth and shelter, in the company of someone who loved her without reservation or condition. Winifred had been awake for most of it, sitting with her mother the way she had sat with her through the whole of the winter, close, present, useful where she could be useful, and simply there where she could not. The last breath came at the gray edge of dawn. She sat with her for a long time after. There is a particular quality to the space left by a person who has just died that cannot be adequately described to someone who has not experienced it. The presence persists for a time, not in any sense beyond the physical, but in the purely physical sense that a person is a body in space, and the space retains the shape of them for a while after the body has concluded its business there. Winifred sat in that shape and she let the grief arrive in its full dimensions without managing it or redirecting it or applying any of the discipline that survival had taught her. Grief is not a problem to be solved. She had understood this imperfectly when Garrett died, and she understood it now with a depth and completeness that made what she had felt in October seem not less real, but less fully received. This grief had the entire winter in it. Every day of the last 3 months was part of it. She buried her mother in the alcove Prentice Holt had noted in his first journal, a small, sheltered recess deep in the cave system, where the rock had the quality of true permanence and the air was as still as anything Winifred had ever encountered. She marked the grave with flat granite stones from the western wall, the same stones she had moved to build the hearth, and she arranged them with a care that was its own language, that said everything she needed to say and did not require any other medium. She spent the rest of that day and the next in a quiet that was different from the winter's quiet. Not empty, filled in fact with her mother's voice, with Dorothea's particular way of observing the world precisely and speaking the essential thing in the minimum number of words and letting the rest go. On the morning of the 30th, she picked up Prentice Holt's third journal, the one that had been blank when she found it, and she opened it to the first page and wrote the date. Below it, she wrote her mother's name and the full span of her years in a single line. She knew this cave. She did not tell me. That was the greatest gift she ever gave. Then she turned to the next page and began to write. Not about Dorothea, not yet. That would come later when she had the distance to do it justice. She wrote about the cave, about the hearth and the correct ratio of clay to sand, and the proportions of the throat that she had learned first from Holt's diagram, and then from her own failure, and then from rebuilding in the dark. About the coal seam in the eastern passage and how to reach it safely, and the correct ratio of coal to wood for sustained overnight burning. About the fresh water that condensed from the ceiling in the northeastern corner and the best placement for a vessel to collect it. About the deer trails she had mapped and the stands of pine below the eastern ridge that provided the best firewood and the medicinal plants Dorothea had identified before the snow came, yarrow and mullein on the southern exposure of the lower slope, and where to find them when the melt was complete. She was doing what Prentice Holt had done. She understood this clearly. Writing in that cave in the first light of March 30th, with fresh grief and spring light both pressing at the edges of her awareness. She understood that this was what Holt had understood when he wrote his first journal entry in October of 1861, that knowledge acquired in hard places at high cost does not belong to the person who acquired it. It belongs to whoever needs it next. The chain of it, Holt to her to whoever comes after, was not sentiment or philosophy. It was the most practical thing she could imagine. Survival extended beyond the individual life into something that outlasts any single winter. She wrote for 3 days. On the 1st of April, she walked down the mountain. The descent took half the time the ascent had. The snow was softening and compacting, and the sled was lighter. And she was, in every physical sense, a different instrument than the woman who had climbed this slope in December. Thinner, yes, her clothing hung differently, the canvas coat cinched at the waist with a rope because the belting had nothing to buckle to anymore. Her face had been changed by smoke and cold and months of altitude without the protection of solid walls. Her hands carried the permanent calluses of sustained heavy work, settled into the skin as if they intended to stay, which they did, but she moved differently. The change was in the quality of her movement, the way weight was distributed, the way each step was placed, the way her eyes moved over the terrain, reading it for information rather than experiencing it as obstacle. She moved like someone who had learned the specific language of this specific landscape and was no longer translating it. The sled carried things she had made and preserved: dried herbs, tallow candles rendered from Clover's fat reserves, a small supply of the cave's coal, two of Holt's 3 journals. She had left the third journal, the one containing her own writing, in the crate in the cave alongside Holt's first 2 for whoever came next. She had made copies of the most critical pages in her own hand. She had left the hearth burning low and banked because she intended to return. The cave was her home and would remain so. Millhaven looked smaller than she remembered. This was not an error of perception. It was an accurate reading of proportion. She had spent 4 months in a landscape of genuine scale: the mountain, the winter, the vast and largely indifferent sky of Montana at its most extreme. And measured against that scale, the arrangement of wooden buildings that constituted Millhaven had contracted to its actual size. It was a small town in a large state, on a large continent, on a very large and mostly indifferent world, and the opinions it had formed about Winifred Calloway had precisely the weight that any opinion carries in proportion to the scale of the life generating it. She walked through the main street. She was aware of the effect her presence created, could observe it propagating through the faces of people she passed: the arrested motion, the held breath, the specific recalibration of a face encountering something it had filed under a heading that no longer applied. She had been in the town's winter accounting, classified among the dead. She was walking through the assumption that had been made about her. She did not perform anything for any of it, did not arrange her expression or her posture into a message. She walked the way she had walked on the mountain, with her attention on the next necessary thing. She needed salt and flour and seed corn and a new axe handle and a pound of nails and 60 feet of good rope. She had pelts to trade: rabbit and fox and 2 beaver, properly cured in the cave's back passage during the latter weeks of winter. She did not need charity. She needed commerce. She was at the door of Harlan's Mercantile when it opened from inside. Aldous Greer stood in the threshold. He had not been expecting her. The evidence of this was immediate and unambiguous. A slight physical recoil, not guilt, she thought, but genuine shock. The shock of a man confronted with the living version of what he had last seen as a problem concluded. He was in his shirt sleeves with his vest buttoned and his reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead, where he had shoved them when he heard the door. He held an open ledger in one hand. He looked at her. She looked at him. The street around them had gone quiet in that particular way that public spaces go quiet when the people in them collectively recognize that something is happening that they should witness. Winifred looked at Aldous Greer, and she did not feel the anger she would have expected herself to feel. She had felt that anger in December, standing in the street with the sled harness on her shoulders, and she had carried it up the mountain, and she had burned it through the worst nights the way she burned coal, for its heat when other heat was insufficient. She had used it completely. What remained was not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness implies a debt canceled, and she had not decided that anything had been canceled. What remained was clarity, the clarity of a person who has been stripped of everything peripheral and is left with only what is essential and true. She saw Aldous Greer with that clarity now, a man who had confused the rules he administered for the wisdom that had generated those rules, a man who had looked at a widow and her elderly mother in December and performed a calculation that reduced them from people to problems, and had not understood that the calculation was wrong, not because it was cruel, but because it was incomplete. It had not accounted for what the widow knew, or what she was capable of, or what the mountain would offer someone willing to do the work. His arithmetic had been bad. That was not a moral failure so much as a failure of imagination. The specific failure of a man who has never been required to find out what he is made of, because everything he needed has always been already there. She had spent the winter correcting his arithmetic. Without his permission or his participation, she had corrected every error he had made on the mountain that he and everyone in Millhaven had assumed would conclude her. He opened his mouth. She shook her head. Once. The same single sharp movement although she had made in December, leaving the meeting. The same gesture, but carrying different weight now. Not the weight of a woman refusing to beg, but the weight of a woman who has nothing left to prove and therefore nothing left to argue about. She had proven what needed proving. The proving was done. She had not come here for a conversation about December. He closed his mouth. Something moved across his face. A complicated passage of a man arriving at a reckoning he had not prepared for and had no procedure for managing, moving through it in public without the option of privacy or time. She watched it happen without helping it or hindering it. It was his reckoning to make, not hers to manage. When it was done, he did the thing she had not predicted. He looked down, not a performance of contrition, not a theatrical gesture calibrated for the audience on the street, a simple physical thing. His eyes dropped from her face to the porch boards and stayed there. And his shoulders, which had always carried the particular set of a man who is the final authority in any room he enters, changed their angle by a few degrees. It was enough. It was, in fact, exactly enough. No more and no less than what the situation required and what the truth had earned. She turned and entered the mercantile through the trading entrance, and she conducted her business with Willis, the young clerk who had not been in the meeting in December and who examined her pelts with the professional attention of someone who understood their quality and priced them accordingly. She traded fairly and was traded with fairly, and she packed her supplies and thanked Willis by name. She was almost at the door when she heard her name. She turned. It was not Aldous Greer. It was a man she had not at first noticed in the corner of the store. Cooper Dade, Rufus's younger brother, who had waited at the tree line with the horses when Rufus came to the cave. He had a direct face and careful eyes, and the look of a man who has been considering whether to say something for some time and has decided to say it. He came closer and spoke quietly. Greer filed papers with the Helena District Court, he said, back in February. Claims mineral rights on Ridgeback above the tree line. Uses the same charter provision he used for the property. Winifred looked at him. Cooper said, "I thought you should know." He paused. "I didn't vote for it in December. I want you to know that too." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once. Not the sharp, closing nod she had given Greer, but something different. Something that acknowledged what he had said and what it cost to say it and what it meant that he had. "Thank you," she said. His name was Cooper. She used it. She walked out into the April street and stood in the thin beginning warmth and held the new information in her mind and turned it over with the same methodical attention she had given every problem on the mountain. The smoke that would not draw. The mortar that needed remixing. Fletcher Greer's ankle. 8 men with hungry eyes at the cave entrance. Every problem had a structure. Every structure had a point of resolution. Not a flaw, but a place where force applied correctly caused the problem to yield rather than resist. She knew exactly what the resolution to this one was. She walked back through the main street. She passed the spot where Aldous Greer had been standing, but he was gone. Back into the mercantile, or perhaps just gone, which was fine. She was not here for him. She went to the office of a lawyer named Hadley, who operated from the back room of the feed store, and who had, she had been told by someone reliable, successfully represented settlers in 2 previous homestead disputes involving competing claims. She sat across from him and she placed 2 things on his desk. Prentice Holt's first journal, which began in October 1861 and documented in meticulous, dated detail his establishment of residence in the cave, his construction of the shelter system, and 7 years of continuous habitation. And a letter she had written and sealed before coming down the mountain, addressed to the Helena District Land Office, detailing her own continuous residence on Ridgeback Mountain from December 6, 1888 forward, and her intention to apply for a homestead claim under the Homestead Act of 1862, which did not specify the gender of the claimant, had never specified the gender of the claimant, and required only continuous improvement of 160 acres over 5 years and the payment of a modest filing fee. Hadley was read for a long time. She waited. She was good at waiting now. He looked up at her over Holt's journal. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I believe Aldous Greer has a significant problem." She said, "I know." She said it the way she said most things now. Without performance, without theater, with the particular quality of understatement that belongs to someone who has been tested by something larger than ordinary life and has not been found insufficient. She went back up the mountain. The spring and summer passed in the particular rhythm of a life being built deliberately, with attention and without waste. Winifred planted a garden on the southern slope of the cave's approach, a small cleared patch where the soil was dark and the exposure was good, using the seed corn and the vegetable seeds she had traded for in April, and the gardening knowledge that Dorothea had been transmitting to her since childhood. The garden grew, not abundantly. The altitude and the brevity of the growing season saw to that, but sufficiently, which was all that had ever been required. She expanded her knowledge of the mountains systematically, the way Holt had expanded his, learning the deer patterns and the rabbit warrens and the plant medicines on the southern exposure, and the best timber for firewood, and the places where the snow persisted longest in spring, and therefore where water was most reliable in the early dry weeks. She added to the journal. Every week she added to it practical knowledge, observations, the accumulated understanding of a person learning a specific place in specific seasons with specific attention. She came down to Millhaven twice more that spring. She traded. She was traded with. The town adjusted to her existence with the specific awkwardness of a community accommodating the continued presence of someone it had expected to become an absence. People spoke to her. Not everyone, and not all of them easily, but some, the women largely, who had never voted on anything and whose opinions about December were not, she suspected, uniformly aligned with the council's conclusion. On her second visit, she saw Fletcher Greer in the street outside the feed store. He was walking without a crutch, though she could see from the careful way he placed his right foot that the ankle still required consideration. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He stopped. She stopped. The street held them in a moment that had no procedure for it, no social form that covered this specific situation, this specific history, this particular debt, and what, if anything, it required of either of them. Fletcher Greer removed his hat. He held it at his chest the way he had held it at the tree line at the bottom of the slope after the blizzard when she had watched him from the cave entrance, and he had turned back one last time before the trees took him. The same gesture, repeated deliberately, she thought, intentionally, as if he had been practicing it, or at least carrying it with him, waiting for the next time he saw her. She looked at him for a moment. This young man who was not his father, who had been given something on a February mountain that he had not known how to ask for and could not have survived without. She nodded once, not the closing nod, the acknowledging one. He put his hat back on. She walked on. That was sufficient. The legal matter proceeded through its proper channels with the unhurried thoroughness of processes that have no reason to rush and every reason to be accurate. Hadley was competent and, she thought, genuinely interested in the merits of the case. Holt's documented continuous residency from 1861 to 1868 predated the township charter by more than a decade, which created a prior claim that Greer's mineral rights application could not simply override. The homestead application moved through the district office in Helena with the careful deliberation of bureaucracy that is functioning as it is designed to function. In September of 1889, a rider came up the mountain path to the cave entrance. Winifred was working in the garden, harvesting the last of the season's yield before the first frost, when she heard the horse below on the slope. She straightened and watched the rider make his way up, a young man she did not recognize, wearing a territorial postal satchel. He handed her an envelope bearing the seal of the United States Land Office and tipped his hat and said, "Mrs. Calloway, I presume?" And she said yes. And he said, "Been trying to deliver this for 2 weeks, ma'am. Nobody in town seemed to know quite how to find you." And she said, "Now you know." And he said, "Yes, ma'am," and turned his horse and went back down the mountain. She stood in the garden with the September light on her face and the envelope in her hands and the mountain at her back. and she opened it. The document inside was dense with the formal language of official processes, the language that says important things in the most complicated way available to it. But underneath the formality, expressed in various careful formulations across several pages, it said a single simple thing. This land was hers. Not on a piece of paper subject to the reinterpretation of men in back rooms. Hers by law, by documented improvement, by the unbroken chain of human presence and purposeful labor that extended from her own months of work back through Prentice Holt's first October on the mountain. A chain that predated the town of Millhaven itself, predated Aldous Greer's charter, predated every procedural mechanism that had been deployed to remove her from the world she was entitled to inhabit. She stood in her garden on her mountain in the September light, and she read the document twice. Then she folded it carefully, the way you handle something that matters. And she walked into the cave and through the main chamber to the alcove where she had buried her mother, and she stood there for a while in the deep quiet. The stone that marked the grave was warm from the heat that radiated outward from the hearth through the cave system. Warmth that had been built with Winifred's hands and her mother's counsel and a dead man's meticulous instructions. Warmth that now lived in the rock itself. She said quietly, to the stone and to everything behind it, "It's ours, Mama, the way it should have been." She went back to the main chamber, and she put the document in the wooden crate beside Holt's journals and the journal she had written herself. Then she sat down at the cave entrance in the September evening light, which has a quality in Montana that no other light quite replicates, horizontal and golden and full of the year's accumulated warmth, releasing itself into the cooling air with a generosity that the winter will shortly revoke. And she picked up the journal. She opened to the page where she had last written. She wrote the date, September 14th, 1889. Below it she wrote, "The land is confirmed, mine by law and by labor, and by the chain of people who knew this mountain before me, and left what they knew for whoever came next. I am not a visitor here. I am not a refugee, though I arrived as one. I am the person who tends this place, and I intend to do so for as long as I am able. And after that, I intend to leave behind sufficient record that someone else can do it after me." She paused. She looked out at the evening light moving across the valley below, at the small arrangement of wooden buildings that was Millhaven, settling into the dusk at the foot of the mountain, lit from within by the small fires of people going about their evenings. She thought about a morning in December, in a back room, in the cold. She thought about 14 men not looking at her. She thought about a flat voice reading a verdict that was meant to be a door closing and had turned out instead to be the beginning of everything she had needed to find out about herself. She thought about her mother's hand on her cheek in the firelight. She thought about a dead man's handwriting in a leather journal, telling her that the mountain had not turned her away, and neither would he. She thought about smoke rising clean through a throat built right on the second attempt, and the warmth that came after, and what it felt like to have built the thing that was warming you with your own two hands out of nothing but stone and clay, and the determination not to stop. Then she wrote the last line, the line that had been forming in her since December, since the flat voice and the 14 men and the frozen street and the slope in the dark, since the failure and the rebuilding, since her mother's hand and her mother's trust and her mother's long, deliberate silence. Since all of it, everything the mountain had cost her and given her and made of her. They called me a burden. I became the foundation. She closed the journal. She set it in the crate beside the others. Holt's 3 and her own, the chain of them, the conversation across the years between people who had needed this mountain and been received by it and understood that what the mountain gave them was not theirs to keep, but theirs to pass on. The September light made its slow transit across the stone. The fire behind her in the cave breathed through the hearth she had built, warm and steady and patient. The way it had breathed since that third match on the third morning when she had rebuilt the throat correctly and the smoke had risen clean and the warmth had come. Clover stood in the early evening shadow of the cave entrance, looking out at the valley below with the placid attention of an animal for whom the present moment is the only moment, and that was enough. Winifred Calloway looked out at her mountain and her valley and her evening and her life, and she found them sufficient. More than sufficient. She found them in the specific way that things are found to be enough when you have built them yourself from the hardest available materials, to be exactly and precisely what was required. The mountain held its breath and kept its secrets and endured, as it always had, as she would.